I still don't sleep right some nights. That's the honest truth, and I figured I'd start with it because if you knew me you'd know I'm not the sort of man who talks about feelings much. I fix boilers. I've fixed boilers for 31 years now. My hands are rough, my knees are worse, and I've seen a lot of ordinary mornings turn into nothing much at all. But that one morning near Hyde Park, the ordinary sort of cracked open, and I saw something I'll carry to the grave. So let me tell it properly from the start, the way it actually happened, and you can make of it what you will. It was the last week of a warm spring. London had that soft golden light it gets when the winter finally lets go, and everybody was out in it, blinking like they'd forgotten the sun existed. I remember that clearly. The light. The way it fell across the pavement in these long, easy stripes through the trees. I'd come into town to sort out a supplier problem, a whole mess about a valve delivery that had gone to the wrong depot, and I'd parked myself on a bench with a coffee because the shop wasn't open till 9. There was no rush. That's the part I keep coming back to. There was no rush that morning. Nobody knew there needed to be. The park was full of the usual things. Joggers going by in their bright shirts. A woman with a pram walking slow, singing something under her breath to the baby. 2 old fellas near the water feeding the pigeons even though there were signs telling them not to. Tourists everywhere, cameras up, pointing at things I've walked past 1,000 times and never looked at twice. There was a group of school kids in matching caps, all holding a rope so they wouldn't wander off, and a teacher at the front counting heads over and over the way teachers do. Ordinary. All of it so completely ordinary that I didn't think about a single bit of it until later, when I couldn't stop thinking about every single bit of it. Now near the edge of the park, over toward the road, there was a bit of ceremonial fuss going on. I didn't know the details of it. Some royal procession was due to pass through later in the day, some official thing, and they'd set up a section with barriers and a guard posted. One of the proper ones. You know the kind I mean. The tall bearskin hat, the red tunic, standing so still you half wonder if he's real. Tourists love them. There was already a little cluster of people around him, taking photos, some of the younger ones pulling faces trying to make him laugh. He didn't move. Of course he didn't. That's the whole point of them. I want to describe him properly because he matters more than anyone in this story, and back then he was just a shape in a red coat to me. He was young. I could see that even from a distance, from the smoothness of his jaw and the way he held himself, that stiff, proud way young men hold themselves when they've just learned to be proud of something. He had this steadiness about him, not a stillness like a statue, a stillness like a held breath. There's a difference, and I only understood it later. A statue is still because it can't move. He was still because he'd decided to be. A little girl was standing right in front of him. Couldn't have been more than 6. She had a red balloon and a jam sandwich, and she was staring up at this guard with her mouth open like he was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen in her whole short life. Her mum was fussing behind her trying to get a photo, telling her to stand still, and the girl wasn't listening. She was just looking up at him. And I swear, though he didn't move a muscle, I saw his eyes flick down at her for half a second. Just half a second, then back up, like he couldn't help himself. Like even a man trained to be a statue is still a man, and a small girl with a jam sandwich is still a small girl. I finished my coffee. I remember crumpling the cup and looking round for a bin. That's the last completely normal thing I did that day, looking round for a bin, and I've thought about that too, how the world doesn't warn you. There's no music that swells up. There's no sign in the sky. 1 second you're looking for somewhere to throw your rubbish, and the next second everything you understand about a nice spring morning is gone. It came from the far side, toward the road, past the barriers over where the traffic was. I didn't see it start. What I felt first was in my chest, this deep punch of pressure that hit before the sound did, this thing that shoved the air out of me and rattled the bench under me and made the coffee cup jump out of my hand. And then the noise. God, the noise. I can't do it justice. It wasn't a bang like you'd imagine. It was bigger than a sound. It was like the whole morning got torn in half. Like somebody took the sky and ripped it. For a second, maybe 2, nobody did anything. That's the thing people don't tell you about moments like that. There's a silence first. A terrible held silence where every single person is standing frozen, working out in some animal part of their brain what just happened, whether it's real, whether they're allowed to be as scared as they suddenly are. I saw the woman with the pram standing dead still, one hand gripping the handle so hard her knuckles went white. I saw the two old men by the water with their bag of bread frozen mid-throw. And then the silence broke, all at once, and everybody started screaming. It's a sound I hope you never hear. A crowd of people all becoming afraid at exactly the same moment. It doesn't sound like one thing. It sounds like 100 things tearing loose. People running in every direction, some toward the noise before they understood, most away from it, colliding, falling, pulling each other up. The school kids, that rope they were holding, it all came apart, and the teacher was screaming names, screaming and grabbing and trying to gather them like she could hold the whole terrified world together with her two arms. A pushchair went over. Somebody's shopping burst open across the path. A man near me just sat down on the ground, right down on the ground, and put his hands over his head and didn't move. And there was smoke. It came rolling up over the trees from the direction of the road, dark and thick and wrong, climbing into that beautiful golden light and staining it. You could smell it a second later, this bitter chemical stink that got in the back of your throat. Somewhere alarms had started, car alarms, building alarms, this whole ugly chorus of it. And under all of it, under the screaming and the alarms, I could hear something worse, which was the sound of people who were hurt. I won't dwell on it. But you know it when you hear it, that sound. And once you've heard it, you never forget it. I got up. I don't remember deciding to. My legs just did it. And I stood there like an idiot, this 50-something boiler engineer, turning in a circle, not knowing which way to go, not knowing what to do with my useless hands. Everybody around me was the same. That's what fear does. It doesn't make you brave and it doesn't make you a coward. Mostly it just makes you stupid. It takes away the part of you that knows what to do and leaves you standing there turning in circles. And that's when I looked over at the guard. He hadn't moved. That's the first thing that hit me. Through all the chaos, this one still point in a world gone mad. Everybody else was running or falling or screaming, and this young man in his red coat was standing exactly where he'd been standing, in exactly the same position, spine straight, chin level, eyes forward. For one horrible second I thought maybe the blast had done something to him, knocked something loose in him, that he was frozen out of shock. But then I looked closer and I understood, and understanding it is the thing that changed me. He wasn't frozen, he was holding. I could see it in his face. He was young, I told you that, and his face wasn't a mask right then. I was close enough to see it. His jaw was tight. There was a muscle going in his cheek. His eyes, forward as they were wet and wide, and I realized this boy was every bit as frightened as the rest of us. Of course he was. He was a young man and the world had just exploded a couple of 100 yards from where he stood. His body wanted to run the same as mine did, the same as everybody's did. You could see the want in him. You could see him fighting it, and he was winning. The little girl with the balloon was still there. That's what I noticed next, and it turned my stomach cold. In all the running and the screaming, this little 6-year-old had gotten separated from her mum, or her mum had gone down, I couldn't tell. But she was standing there right in front of the guard, absolutely rigid with terror, her balloon gone, her sandwich on the ground, crying without even seeming to know she was crying, the way very small children cry with their whole body. And people were running past her, actually knocking into her. A grown man clipped her shoulder and spun her half around and just kept going, didn't even look back, and she stumbled and nearly went down. And the guard's eyes came down. Just like before, that half-second flick. Except this time it wasn't half a second. This time his eyes came down to that little girl and they stayed there, and I watched this whole war happen on his face in about the space of 2 heartbeats. Everything he'd been trained to do, all that discipline, all that stillness, the whole weight of what his uniform meant, all of it saying stand, hold, do not move, do not break formation. And underneath it this other thing, this older and simpler thing, this thing that lives in every decent person, saying that's a child, that's a frightened child and she is alone. I've thought about that moment more than I've thought about almost anything in my life, because I know what most of us would have done. Most of us in a uniform we'd worked for, on a post we'd been ordered to hold, with a bomb going off and every excuse in the world to stay exactly where it was safe to stay, most of us would have found a way to tell ourselves it wasn't our job. Somebody else will help her. I have my orders. I can't leave my post. And we'd have been telling ourselves the truth in a way. It wasn't his job. He did have his orders. He wasn't supposed to move. He moved. Not all at once. That's the part that gets me. He didn't just bolt. He turned his head first, this small, deliberate turn, scanning, and I understood he was checking, working out in a half a second whether the threat was still coming, whether moving would put the child in more danger than staying. He was thinking. In the middle of all that, with his heart surely going like a hammer, this young man was thinking, doing the job right up until the last possible instant. And then, having decided, he broke. He came off that post like something released. 3 long strides and he was down on one knee in front of the girl, this big lad in a red coat and a bearskin hat folding himself down to her level, and I saw his mouth moving, saying something to her I couldn't hear over the noise. Whatever it was, it worked, or it started to. She stopped that awful rigid shaking for just a second and looked at him, and he put out his arms. Now here's a thing I need you to understand about those men and those uniforms. They don't touch people. They don't break formation. There are rules stacked on top of rules about what they can and can't do, and 100 people a day try to make them react, and they never do. They've had that drilled so deep into them it's practically in their bones. And this lad scooped up a crying child off the ground and stood, holding her against his chest, one big hand cupped around the back of her head, the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping. I started moving then, toward them. I don't know what I thought I could do, but I couldn't stand there anymore, not after seeing that. And as I got closer, I could hear him. He was talking to her, low and steady, this calm, even voice that didn't match at all the fear I'd seen in his eyes a moment before. He was saying, "You're all right, I've got you. We're going to find your mum, you're safe, I've got you." Over and over. And the little girl had her face buried in his shoulder and her small hands fisted in the red of his tunic. And she was still crying, but it had changed. It had gone from that awful terror to just the ordinary crying of a frightened child who has, against all the odds, found somebody strong to hold onto. The smoke was thicker now. People were still running. Somewhere I could hear the first siren starting up, far off but coming. And I remember standing a few feet away from this young guard holding this little girl and thinking a thought so clear it almost hurt. I thought, that is the bravest thing I have ever seen, not the moving. Anybody can move, the staying and then the choosing. He'd held that post through the worst thing that had ever happened to him, held it out of duty, and then he'd given it up out of love, and both of those things were the same courage wearing 2 different faces. Her mum found them, came out of the crowd with blood on her forehead and her whole face broken open with panic, screaming the girl's name. And when she saw her in the guard's arms, she made a sound I've never heard a person make before, this sound of pure animal relief, and she just about collapsed into them both. The guard passed the child over careful as anything, careful as if the little girl were made of glass, and I saw him steady the mother with his free hand because her legs were going. And then, and this is the bit I'll never get over, he straightened up, and he looked back toward his post, toward the empty spot where he was supposed to be standing. And I saw him think about going back to it. I swear to you that's true. In the middle of all that horror, this lad, this boy really, having just done the most human thing a person can do, looked back at his post and I watched the pull of it on him, the training, the duty, the shame maybe at having left it. And a part of me wanted to grab him and shake him and say, "Son, there's no post left to hold, look around you. The whole world's on fire, you've done enough. You've done more than enough." But I didn't have to. Because right then the sirens got loud, and the emergency people started pouring in, and everything moved into a different phase, and I lost sight of him in the crowd and the smoke. But I hadn't lost him for good. Not by a long way. Because what I saw in the next hour in the middle of all that wreckage is the real story, and I've only just gotten to the start of it. Let me back up a little, though, because there's a thing I skipped and it matters. When the blast first hit, in that terrible held silence before everybody started screaming, I looked at the guard the very first time and I noticed something I didn't understand yet. His hand. His right hand, the one nearest me, had moved. Just an inch. His fingers had curled just slightly, the way your hand does when your whole body wants to grab something, anything, and hold on. And then I watched him uncurl them, one finger at a time, and lay them flat against his leg again. He was pulling himself back. He was doing it on purpose, this act of will, forcing his own frightened body to obey him. I've never forgotten those fingers. A young man teaching his own hand to be still while the world came apart. There was an old woman near me through all of this. I keep thinking about her too. She'd been sitting on the next bench over, feeding herself little bits of a bun, one of those small, neat elderly women who seemed to have been sitting on that exact bench since before the park was built. When the bomb went off, she didn't scream and she didn't run. She just sat there, very upright, with her hands folded in her lap, watching everything with these calm, pale eyes. And at one point she looked over at me, this total stranger, and she said, in the mildest voice you ever heard, she said, "It's happening again then." And I didn't know what she meant, not right then, but I found out later she'd been a girl in London during the war, and she'd sat through worse than this as a child, and something about the way she said it, so quiet and so unsurprised, made my blood run cold. It's happening again then. As if the city had a memory and she was part of it. I want to be honest about my own part in all this because it isn't much and I won't pretend it was. I didn't do anything heroic. I never do. In the whole thing, from the blast to the end, I helped exactly 2 people, and I'll tell you about them because they're true, but I want it understood that I'm the witness here, not the hero. The hero's in the red coat. I'm just the boiler man who happened to be looking the right way at the right time. The first person I helped was a young lad, a tourist by the look of him, maybe 20, who'd been near the barriers when it went off and had gone down and couldn't seem to get up. He wasn't badly hurt, I don't think, but he was dazed, properly dazed, sitting on the ground with a trickle of blood coming from his ear, and this blank, confused look on his face like a man who'd been woken too suddenly from a deep sleep. I got down next to him and I said, "All right, mate, all right, I've got you, come on, let's get you up and away from here." And he looked at me and he said something in a language I didn't know, French maybe, and then he said in English, thick and slow, "My phone. Where is my phone?" And I nearly laughed, God forgive me, because there's a bomb gone off and this boy's worried about his phone. But of course that's exactly it, isn't it? When the big thing is too big to hold, your mind reaches for the small thing. His phone, I found his phone. It had skidded a few feet away, and it was cracked right across, but it was there. And I put it in his hand, and I closed his fingers round it, and something in his face settled, just a little, and we got him up and moving. It was while I was doing that, half carrying this dazed young tourist toward where it seemed safer, that I saw the guard again. He'd handed the little girl back to her mum by then, and I'd thought, in the part of my mind that was still capable of thinking, that he'd stop. That he'd done his bit and now he'd sit down or find shelter or wait for orders like a sensible person. He didn't. I watched him move deeper in, toward the smoke, toward the road, toward the part everybody else was running away from. He'd taken the hat off. That's the first change I noticed. The bearskin was gone, and without it he looked younger and smaller and more ordinary, just a young man with short dark hair in a red coat, and somehow that made it worse, made it braver, because now he wasn't a soldier from a postcard. Now he was just a lad walking into the smoke. He'd shrugged off the tunic too, or opened it at least, and he'd got it half off one shoulder, and I realized why a second later when I saw him drop down beside somebody on the ground and press that heavy red fabric against a wound. He was using his own uniform, that grand ceremonial coat that people had been photographing all morning. He'd turned it into a bandage. I got my tourist to a safe spot, handed him off to a woman who said she was a nurse, and I stood up and I made a decision I still don't fully understand. I went toward the smoke too, toward the guard, not because I'm brave, I've told you I'm not, but because I'd seen that young man walk in there and I simply could not, stand at the edge and watch a boy half my age do that alone. It would have been like watching someone drown and calling it caution. so I went. My legs were shaking the whole way. I'm not ashamed to say it. My legs were shaking and my mouth had gone dry as sand, and every step took a separate argument with myself, but I went. And what I found in there, past the smoke near the road, is the part of this story I've never told properly to anyone. Not my wife. Not my kids. I've carried it 15 years and I've never laid it out straight, and I'm going to now, and it's going to take me a while, so stay with me. Because what that young royal guard did in the next hour, with the sirens screaming and the smoke rolling and the worst morning of everybody's lives happening all around him, is the kind of thing that makes you believe in people again. And God knows there are days I need to believe in people. But that's part two. Let me catch my breath first. Some of this is hard to say even now, so, the smoke. Let me put you inside it, because words are all I've got and I want you to see it the way I saw it. Past the barriers near the road, the world was a different place from the park I'd been sitting in 5 minutes before. The pretty golden light couldn't get through the smoke anymore, so everything had gone gray and brown and strange. This dirty haze you had to squint through. There was a smell that I still can't shake, this mix of burnt metal and something chemical, and underneath it something worse that I won't name but you can guess. Things were scattered everywhere. Shoes. A single shoe on its own in the middle of the road, and I don't know why, but that shoe undid me more than almost anything. Bags. Bits of the barrier itself, twisted up. Glass, so much glass all over the ground, catching what little light there was. And I should say before I go on that nobody knew yet what had happened. That's a thing you forget looking back. In that first hour we didn't know if it was a bomb, an accident, a gas main, an attack, whether there'd be another one, whether the smoke itself was poison. Nobody knew anything. And that not knowing was its own kind of horror, this cloud of dread hanging over everybody, because the mind fills a gap like that with the worst thing it can imagine. Every loud noise made people flinch. A car door slammed somewhere and I saw 50 people drop to the ground. We were all just waiting for the second one. And the guard, in the middle of that, moving around like the second one wasn't a thing he was afraid of, or like he'd decided being afraid of it was a luxury he couldn't afford. That took a kind of nerve I don't have words for. And people down, people sitting. People wandering with that same dazed look my tourist had, drifting through the smoke like ghosts, some of them calling names, some of them saying nothing at all. It was quieter in there than you'd think. The screaming had mostly moved outward away, and what was left was this low broken murmur, people moaning, people crying softly, people saying help, help in these small voices that somehow cut through worse than shouting would have. The guard was in the thick of it. I found him kneeling by a man who was in a bad way, and I'm not going to describe the man because he deserves his privacy even now, but I'll tell you what the guard was doing. He had his red tunic pressed hard against the man's side with both hands, leaning his whole weight into it, and he was talking, that same low, steady voice I'd heard him use with the little girl. Stay with me. Look at me. What's your name? Come on now, tell me your name. That's it, good man, stay with me. And the man was trying to answer. You could see him trying, and the guard kept him trying, kept pulling his eyes back every time they started to drift, kept him in the world by the sheer force of that calm, insistent voice. I knelt down on the other side. I said, "What do you need?" Just that. And the guard looked up at me, and for the first time I saw his face up close, and God, he was young. Younger than I'd even thought. 22, 23 at the most. He had these dark eyes and a smear of somebody else's blood across his cheek, and a look in him that I can only call ancient, like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, which I suppose he had. He looked at me for half a second, sizing me up, deciding whether I was any use, and then he said, "Press here. Hard. Don't stop pressing no matter what he does." And he moved my hands onto the wound and put his own on top of mine for a second to show me how hard, and it was harder than I'd have dared. And then he was up and gone, off to the next one. That's how the next hour went. That's the shape of it. This young man moving through the smoke from one broken person to the next, doing what he could, and me trailing after him doing whatever he told me. He'd become, without anybody deciding it, the person in charge. Not because of his uniform, though maybe that helped. people look for a uniform in a disaster. They want somebody to be in charge. But it was more than the coat. It was him. It was the calm. In all that horror he'd found this deep, steady calm, and he was handing it out to everyone he touched. And people were reaching for it like drowning people reach for a rope. I saw him do things I'll never forget. I saw him take his own boot off, and his sock, and use the sock to tie off a bad wound on a woman's arm, kneeling there in one boot in the middle of the road, and never once did he seem to notice or care how strange he looked. I saw him lie flat on the filthy road next to an old man who'd gone into some kind of shock, lie right down beside him in the glass and the dirt, and hold the old man's hand and talk to him about football, of all things, about a match, keeping the old fella's mind occupied, keeping him here, until the paramedics could get to him. I saw him carry a child, a different child this time, a boy of maybe 8, carry him clear of a spot where something was smoking and might catch, carry him with the boy's blood soaking into what was left of that red coat. And here's a thing about him, a small thing, but it tells you everything. Every single person he helped, he asked their name. Everyone. And he used it. Not once did he say sir or madam or mate. He learned your name and he said it back to you over and over, your own name in his calm young voice. And I realized after a while why he was doing it, or I think I did. Because when you're that frightened, when you're hurt and scared and the world's on fire, the worst thing, the very worst thing, is to feel like you've stopped being a person. Like you've become a casualty, a statistic, a thing. And this lad wouldn't let a single one of them stop being a person. He gave them their names back. In the middle of all that, he gave everyone their name. There was a woman I helped him with that I think about a lot. Middle-aged, ordinary-looking, the sort of woman you'd pass on the street 100 times and never notice. She'd been hurt in the legs and she couldn't walk, and she was calm, eerily calm. But she kept saying she had to get to her office because there was a meeting. She was going to be late for the meeting and she got quite upset about this meeting. And the guard didn't argue with her. He didn't tell her there was no meeting, that the meeting was the last thing in the world that mattered now. He just knelt down and he took her hand and he said, "I've called ahead. They know you're going to be late. They said don't worry about a thing, just look after yourself. They've got it covered." Which was a lie, a complete lie. He hadn't called anyone. But I watched all the tension go out of that woman's face, this flood of relief, because the small frightened thing her mind had latched onto had been taken care of. And I thought, that's a kind of genius, that is. That's a kind of mercy most people never learn. There was a moment, maybe 40 minutes in, when it caught up with him. I saw it. He'd just finished with someone and the paramedics had finally arrived in force and were taking over, and there was this little gap, this little pause, the first one he'd had, and in that pause I watched the calm slip. Just for a second. He was crouched down on his heels with his bloody hands hanging between his knees and his head dropped forward, and his shoulders started to shake, and I understood he was crying, this silent, terrible crying, all of it coming out of him now that there was finally room for it. And I did the only thing I could think of. I went and I crouched down next to him and I put my hand on his shoulder and I didn't say anything clever. I just said, "You did good, son. You did so good." And he leaned into my hand for a second. Just for a second, this exhausted young man leaning into the hand of a stranger, and then he pulled himself back together and got up and went to help someone else. I found out his name eventually, though not from him. He never told me. I asked him once in a quieter moment. I said, "What's your name, son?" turning his own trick back on him, and he half smiled, this tired ghost of a smile, and he said, "Doesn't matter." And that was all I got out of him. Doesn't matter. As if the whole point of him was to give everyone else their name and keep none for himself. The little girl comes back into it here, the first one, the one from the start. Because her mum, once the paramedics had checked them both over and found them mostly all right, wouldn't leave. She stayed at the edge of the wreckage with her little girl held tight, and she was watching the guard, watching him work, and I could see her wanting to say something to him and never finding the moment. And at one point the little girl, who'd gone quiet and still against her mother's shoulder, lifted her head and pointed at him through the smoke and said, in this small, clear voice that carried somehow over everything. "That's my friend. That's my friend." And her mum just held her tighter and started crying again, but different crying this time, and I had to look away because I couldn't take it. There was a policeman who tried to move the guard on about an hour in. Meant well, I'm sure. Said something about it not being safe, about civilians needing to clear the area, and I think in the smoke and the mess he didn't clock what the red coat meant, or maybe he did and it didn't matter to him. A scene's a scene. And the guard stood up to him. Not angry. Never angry. He just stood up, this young man, filthy and bloody and exhausted, and he said very quietly, "I'm not leaving while there's people down." And something in the way he said it made the policeman stop, made him just nod once and move on, because you could tell. You could tell there was no moving him. He'd stand his post. He'd decided which post it was, and it wasn't the ceremonial one anymore. It was this one, this terrible one in the smoke, and he was going to stand it till the end. I keep calling it standing his post, and I want to explain why, because it's the heart of the whole thing for me. That morning had started with him standing a post, a ceremonial one, a pretend one almost, if I'm honest, the kind of thing that's mostly for the tourists, standing still in a fancy coat so people can take pictures. And you could be forgiven for thinking a post like that doesn't mean much. But watch what happened. Watch what that boy did with it. When the real thing came, when the actual test of everything that post was supposed to stand for finally arrived, he didn't fail it. He'd been practicing, all those still mornings, all that discipline, all that holding, he'd been practicing for a test he prayed would never come, and when it came, he passed it. He'd learned to stand a pretend post so well that when he got a real one, an unbearable one, he could stand that too. The smoke started to thin after a while. The fires, whatever they were, got put out or burned themselves down, and the wind shifted, and slowly the gray haze pulled back and let a bit of that golden light come through again. And I remember how strange that was, how wrong, to see that soft spring light falling on all that horror. It didn't belong. It was like the light hadn't gotten the message. The morning was still trying to be beautiful, and the ground was covered in glass and blood. The old woman from the bench turned up in the middle of all this, the one who'd said it's happening again. I don't know how she got there, this small elderly woman picking her way through the wreckage, but there she was, and she'd found herself a job. She was going round to the people who were sitting up, the walking wounded, the ones in shock, and she was talking to them, just talking, about nothing. About the weather, about her late husband, about how she'd been through worse and here she still was, and it was doing something. This calm old voice, so unafraid, so sure the world would go on because she'd seen it go on before, it was steadying people. She and the guard never spoke to each other that I saw, but they were doing the same work from opposite ends of a lifetime, the very old and the very young, both of them refusing to let the fear win. More help arrived. It always does in the end, though it never feels fast enough when you're in it. Ambulances, more police, the specialist people in their heavy gear. And gradually the guard's job, the one he'd made for himself, started to shrink, as trained people with proper equipment took over the things he'd been doing with a sock and a torn coat and his bare hands. And I watched him let go of it. That was almost as hard to watch as the rest. He didn't want to let go. Every person the professionals took over, he'd hover for a second, making sure, before he'd move on. And you could see it cost him something to hand each one over, to admit he wasn't needed for that one anymore. And then there came a moment when he wasn't needed for any of them, when the professionals had it, all of it, and there was nothing left for a young man in a ruined red coat to do. And he stood there in the middle of it, in the thinning smoke, in that returning golden light, and he looked around slowly at all of it, at everything that had happened, and I watched the enormity of it start to land on him. While there'd been work to do, he'd been all right. He'd had the work to hide behind. But now the work was gone, and there was just the truth of it, the whole terrible truth, and it was too big, and I saw his face start to crumble. I went to him. I'd stayed near him the whole time, this stubborn boiler man who didn't know why he wouldn't leave. And I got to him just as his knees started to go, and I caught him, this big young lad. I got an arm round him and took his weight, and he sagged against me, done, completely done, all the calm finally spent. And he said something into my shoulder that I've never repeated to anyone until now. He said, I left my post. That's what he said. In the middle of all of it, having done everything he'd done, having saved I don't know how many people, the thing that was breaking him was that at the very start, to catch a falling child, he'd left his post. And I held on to him and I said the only thing there was to say. I said, son, look around you. Look at all these people who are alive. This is your post. This was always your post. You never left it. You just finally found out what it was for. And whether he heard me or believed me, I don't know. But he stopped shaking after a while, and he straightened up, and he wiped his face with the back of his filthy hand, which just smeared it worse, and he looked at me with those ancient young eyes, and he nodded once the way soldiers nod, and he said, "Thank you." And I said, "No, son, thank you." And that's nearly the end. Nearly, but not quite. Because there's one more thing that happened, right at the very end. That's the reason I've never stopped thinking about that morning, and I'll tell it to you in part 3, and then I'll let you go. Before I get there, though, let me say one more thing about that hour, because it's a thing I've come to understand slowly over years, and it took me a long time to put words to it. The whole time I was in that smoke, following that young man around, doing what he told me, I kept waiting to be afraid. Properly afraid, I mean, the runaway kind. And it never came. And for a long time I couldn't work out why, because I'm not a brave man. I've said that, I'll say it again, I'm a boiler man with bad knees. And then one day, years later, doing the washing up of all things, it came to me. I wasn't afraid because he wasn't. That's all. His calm had reached me too. He'd handed it to the wounded and he'd handed it to the frightened, and without meaning to, he'd handed it to me, and it had held me up the whole way through, and I never even noticed it happening. That's a kind of power most people never have. To be so steady, so completely steady in the worst moment of your life, that your steadiness pours out of you and into everyone near you and holds them up too. I've met important men since. Rich men, powerful men, clever men. I've never met another one with that. There was rain that came, right at the end of the hour, out of nowhere, out of that same sky that had been so golden. Just a little, just a soft gray drizzle, but it laid the last of the smoke down and it washed some of the worst of it off the road, and it felt, I'm not ashamed to say it, it felt like something more than weather. It felt like the sky had finally caught up with the morning. Everyone had gone quiet. The loud phase was over. The wounded had mostly been taken away, and what was left was the rain and the wreckage and all of us standing about in it, soaked and stunned, not knowing what to do with ourselves now that the terrible, urgent work was done. And the guard just stood there in the rain with his face turned up to it. This young man, letting it fall on him. And I think it was the first still moment he'd allowed himself since the very first one, since the second the bomb went off and he curled and uncurled his fingers and made himself hold. Just give me a minute. It's the hardest part to say, all right, here it is. The thing I've never told properly.